fat old man sits at his dinner table. This man, dressed in the finery of the minor nobles of Spain from which he comes, looks over a candlelit table of his fellow conquistadores who, retiring for the evening from the vicious encomiendas they oversee, dine with their governor. The old governor and his guests dine on a mix of crops harvested from their plantations. New World wonders like cassava and tropical fruits are combined with the imported Old World staples of wheat and barley. The governor uses these dinners in his stone-built house to hold court, and to watch his subordinates curry favor with him through flattery, something which he is always susceptible to, often in the form of performative laughter at the governor's tired witticisms. Each of these men hopes to hold a position like the governor's, some measure of political establishment in this new land whose gains are as ephemeral as the disappearing indigenous population, which they harvest like so many other resources with little regard to its sustainability. One such of these ambitious young men is the governor's notary. Dark-haired and serious in disposition, tonight he instigates a game of cards, of which he is so fond, gambling huge sums against his fellow conquistadores as all of the men rack up enormous debts among each other. Debts which these men hope to collect from the elusive sources of gold they have torn apart these islands looking for. This notary, a sometimes favorite, sometimes enemy of the governor, has heard of tales of a place known as the Yucatan, a place where 2 expeditions have returned with claims of enormous wealth in indigenous cultures far more complex than the small tribes they have encountered and annihilated up to this point. This notary watches in between rounds of gambling for the shifting moods of his patron governor, because this youthful, scheming notary hopes to twist the governor's arm into awarding him the right to lead a 3rd expedition to the Yucatan and see for himself this rumored land that seemingly holds the answer to decades of Spanish frustration among these islands, a city of gold. As the old governor dines and repeats himself in stories told innumerable times, the notary bides his own time, waiting for the moment when he can plead his case and make his mark in the new world. Hello, and welcome to Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast dedicated to seeing the history of the Americas from within the visions of the people who lived it. I'm your host, Gavrilo Z. Last week, we looked at the rise of the Aztec Empire through the eyes of Tlacaelel, the man who, more than anyone else, shaped what the empire would be and how it would function across the rulership of 5 Tlatoque, bringing us right up to the end of the 15th century and near the peak of the empire's power and territory. But there is now a new empire to introduce, the Spanish. Often misunderstood, this empire was less an imperial vision straight from the Spanish crown more than it was the ramshackle project of its desperate, devious conquistadores who, by the time of the Spanish invasion of Mexico in 1519, had existed for 27 years already in the Caribbean. History has a flattening effect. The farther away you stand, the closer events appear together. The first Spanish Empire wasn't planned. It was improvised. In the Caribbean, men used law, rumor, and brutality to make fiefdoms, and in the process, they ate their own. This episode is about how accident made empire, and how that accident made the colonists cannibals of their own dreams, cannibals far more destructive than the ones they claimed to have found on these new islands. And as they became more and more aware of the abominable crimes they'd committed, invented a legal tradition to justify their actions. So let's follow that trail of crimes in today's episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a podcast where history isn't a story repeating, but a conspiracy unfolding. Episode 1.4, Diego Velazquez and the Spanish Caribbean. The Catholic monarchs, Isabel of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, united the major Spanish realms in 1479, bringing together its 2 largest kingdoms into a kind of personal union between the 2 defined by marriage. Castile, Isabel's domain, was by far the larger and more powerful of the 2. The marriage between Isabel and Ferdinand came with all kinds of clauses and carve-outs which dictated who had power over what between them, but in effect it created, for the first time, a politically united and independent Spain. At least a version of Spain which united the realms which they actually controlled, because parts of Spain were still held by the North African Moors who had, for centuries, ruled the entire Hispanic peninsula. It had been the dream of every good Christian monarch in Spain since to drive out these Muslims and reclaim the land for Christendom. Bit by bit, across hundreds of years, campaigns of the European Spaniards had pushed the Moors back. Now, with Spain stronger than it had ever been, Isabel and Ferdinand mounted an offensive in the southwestern region of Granada, the last holdout of the Reconquista, to drive the Moors out forever. And they were successful. Spain was now, in the year 1492, whole again once more. It was now time for the realm to expand. The monarchs looked out across the sea and wondered what else was out there to conquer. They dreamed of empire. They began by invading the Canary Islands to the southeast off the coast of Africa. There they had driven back the natives and established a colony whose chief merit was in its sugar plantations. But it would soon have another use. Over in Italy, Ferdinand's Aragonese claims in Sardinia and Sicily were used to gain a foothold in Naples, with the Spanish king eyeing northern Italian territories as well. But as the years have gone by in conquest, one man has followed the Catholic monarchs from court to court, begging them to look further west. He was a Genoese, from that region in Italy known for its shipping and commercial ties all across the Mediterranean. But this man had an idea that went beyond simple Genoese mercantilism. Based on an idiosyncratic map of faulty math, he dared to dream that he could sail west around the world, reaching China and the Indies in only a few weeks of travel. For years, this Genoese sailor has begged the monarchs to take heed of his plan, and for years they have ignored him. Now, at the height of their success, the Catholic monarchs began to feel a little more indulgent. They agreed to fund the Genoese plan, and even granted him the incredible and somewhat ridiculous titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Governor-General, and Viceroy of all the lands that he would discover, with all of these titles being hereditary in contrast to all Spanish precedent. This man's name was Cristobal Colon, and he would commit himself to innumerable discoveries whose importance he never fully understood, but which would have fateful consequences for the rest of the world. Colon sailed the ocean sea in 1492 and 1493. The Catholic monarchs financed but were skeptical of Colon's first voyage. Their support, however, combined with further private financing, was enough for Colon to secure a fleet of 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, which he first sailed to the Canary Islands as an important launching point, before pointing his fleet west. He believed himself bound for China, but was, of course, off in his estimation of the distance between Europe and Asia by magnitudes. The crew he selected was filled with sailors, merchants, second sons of minor noble families, cast-offs, and runaways fleeing the law. They were not soldiers. Many of them were hardly sailors. They were promised wages they would not be paid for 21 years after the voyage. After weeks at sea, morale plummeted. There was no land in sight, and Colon, freed from the feudal restraints of the Catholic monarchs, began his megalomania on board, becoming more sure of himself with each passing day of failure. He compared himself to Moses. His crew mocked him by referring to him as Pharaoh. They considered murdering him to take the ships back to the Canaries. Colon, in response, offered a silk coat to the first man who would spot land. The sailors received this promise in silence. What good is a silk coat to men stranded at sea? And so 6 weeks would pass until land was spotted. Colon stole the credit, saying that he had seen it hours before anyone else. The men then landed in what they thought to be Asia, and Colon raised a Spanish flag on the new island he named San Salvador. It was a curious move, considering that Colon thought he was in China, and it's difficult to rationalize the calculus of a man who, upon finding what he believes to be another country, raises his own country's flag upon first contact. But of course, we know that Colon did not discover China, but the Caribbean. And when he landed, his people made contact with the people of this island, the Taínos, they were called. Colon and his compatriots noted that the Taíno had gold jewelry and trinkets. They pantomimed questions of where it came from. The Taíno, practicing the art of self-preservation, claimed it came from over there, on another island. The Spanish duly chased after it. Colon and his men found gold and enslaved some of the natives to be brought back to Spain. Some of them he hoped to train in Spanish so they could be interpreters in the future. With only one ship in seaworthy condition and not enough space to bring everyone aboard, Colon founded a town called La Navidad on Christmas Day, and left behind a few dozen sailors as Spain's first colonists, and sailed away. Most of these men would be dead before the admiral's return. He returned to Spain in early 1493, with slaves and treasures in stow. The Catholic monarchs feigned interest but remained skeptical of this bizarre man and his mission. Queen Isabel sternly told Colón that if he were to claim these new lands and the glory of Spain, then the people of these lands were Spanish subjects, and, as such, it would be inappropriate for one Spanish subject to enslave another. Colón was sheepish in the face of this logic and protested that these men he had captured were in fact heathens, using the old logic of enslaving Moors during the Reconquista. Colón added that many were cannibals and unfit to be Spanish subjects. Isabel demurred and then said that she would make an exception to her no-slave rules for cannibals, and so future colonists would use this carve-out to great effect, labeling any indigenous resistor a Carib, or cannibal, and be free to enslave them as they wished. But by now, it was mid-1493, and Colón thought that he might go back to see how his colonies were doing. On his second voyage, new would-be colonists signed up, many as volunteers. One of these new colonists was a man named Diego Velazquez. Diego Velazquez was from Cuellar, a town of former importance in the Kingdom of Castile, having once been the site of the region's wool trade and a seat of the Crown of Castile. But the crown had moved into Madrid, and the wool trade had hit a recession, leaving Cuellar irrelevant and impoverished. Its minor nobles clung proudly to their titles, even as their fortunes evaporated. Velazquez, born in 1464, came from a prominent family that had outgrown its usefulness to the crown. And so Diego, in his late 20s, left for the Caribbean for the same reason many in his position did. There was simply nowhere else for him to go. This second voyage landed back in the Caribbean in late 1493, and aboard, Velazquez was quick to make a name and rank for himself on the island of Hispaniola. He was jovial and hospitable to other Spaniards as much as he was cruel and thoughtless with the Taíno. He loved a good joke, hearty banter, and was known for his quick riposte in conversation. He was also quick to anger, but just as easily quick to forgive, no more so than for his subordinate Spaniards, who so often ignored his instruction as the future governor of Cuba as they did follow it. Upon landing on Hispaniola, Velazquez did what all other Spaniards set out to do on the islands: secure gold as quickly as possible. When the gold of these islands, still thought to be off the coast of Asia, was not forthcoming, the Spaniards realized the slave trade of the indigenous as well as the Africans, which had started by the way of the Portuguese, was a perfectly profitable substitute. And Velazquez had arrived on Hispaniola just as the conquest of it was truly beginning. Colón's second fleet had left with dozens of ships and hundreds more colonists than the voyage prior. And unlike that first voyage, this one was explicitly for the purposes of colonizing the new lands in the name of the Spanish crown. The Spaniards, however, had more than just the crown on their mind. Many of these men, as it was said, arrived with heavy debts incurred for expenses in reaching the Indies, as these new islands were now being called, and were quick to set out looking for a way to make a quick profit to pay back these debts. As an incentive to fight on Spain's and his own behalf, Colón offered these Spaniards awards of what were called encomiendas, a grant of a certain number of indigenous slaves and indentured servants, which could vary from a few dozen to thousands. These were not necessarily grants of land, but the Spaniards did not often make such distinctions and took it upon themselves to claim huge tracts of land anyway, that they would operate as their own personal feudal kingdoms. These second sons and castaways of Spain and Europe wanted to recreate the very system that had left them out back at home, except this time they would be on top. And Velazquez, working underneath Colón but commanding these hundreds of Spanish men, quickly learned that the feudal society that they wished to recreate in the Caribbean could not be founded on principle, but only coercion. And so they waged a war on the natives. The Taíno who were not murdered were drafted into encomiendas by the conquistadores, where through overwork, cruelty, and starvation they died in mass numbers. The Spanish, who noted grimly the dropping of the indigenous population, did little to curb their abuses or connect the two. Few spoke out against these barbarous practices. But among those who did was a Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas, a former encomendero himself who would renounce his holdings and go on to be one of the most vocal and persistent critics of the Spanish colonial project. Velazquez weathered the chaos of these early years underneath the admiral, who had shown himself to be a dismal administrator. Over the years, Velazquez offered himself as an alternative of competence. Colón would proclaim and the colonists would ignore him. Atrocities were carried out by everyone on the islands as they swept across Hispaniola, wiping out the Taínos in battle and then enslaving the survivors. The Taíno died hundreds at a time, with many of them committing suicide rather than falling into Spanish hands. And the Spaniards died nearly as quick, with 2/3 of them succumbing to dysentery, tropical fevers, and the syphilis they contracted from Taino women within months of landing. Colon himself was not above the cruelties of his own men, and it was said that he would lop off the ears, noses, and tongues of those who spoke out against him, Spanish or indigenous alike. Velazquez was particularly adept at navigating the treacheries of the Spanish occupation of these new lands. He became rich in Hispaniola off of indigenous enslavement and the tricky political waters by befriending the admiral's son, Diego Colon, who would then go on to become the governor of the Caribbean islands himself in the future. Velazquez was well-equipped, well-trusted, and well-disposed to being useful to the men in charge of running these disorganized, ill-tempered colonies. Indigenous resistance to the Spanish continued to be fierce but ineffective. The Taino were simply no match for Spanish steel and were hacked to pieces. Massacres happened weekly, even as the Spaniards began to realize the limits of butchering a people they also needed to rely on for their labor. The stories of the cruelties and incompetence of Colon's administration of the colonies became so fierce that when it reached the Spanish crown, the Catholic monarchs felt compelled to replace Colon as the Governor-General of Hispaniola. His replacements, however, were hardly any more humanist for the indigenous than Colon had been. They were a small junta of crown officials who arrived to govern the new colonies, each of them with their own agendas to pursue. One arrived with such a grudge and flair for the dramatic that he arrested Colon and his brothers after their disastrous fourth voyage, which had stranded the brothers off of the coast of Jamaica for months. The admiral and his family were shipped back off to Spain in chains. But it mattered little who was in charge of the Taino. The policy of conquest continued across the island regardless of who was in charge. Each governor would dismiss the indigenous as primitive and make no effort at reconciliation or understanding. Violent harassment and butchery continued. Realizing they could not beat the Spaniards on the battlefield, Taino caciques, or chieftains, resorted to other tactics. One such cacique was Queen Anacahuana. Diego Velazquez has seen Hispaniola nearly conquered. One by one, the caciques of the island fell to Spanish steel and slavery. What few holdouts remained independent were living on borrowed time. One such was Queen Anacahuana. Velazquez has heard of her, as has his boss, the governor of Hispaniola. The governor sends out a message to this last holdout: submit to the Spanish authority or die. Anacahuana responds in kind with offers for a fiesta to commemorate the relationship between Spanish and Taino. Velazquez, however, suspects trickery by way of flattery. He accepts the proposal but tells his men to remain on guard for ambush. The fiesta is held at Anacahuana's village. Food is gathered and displayed as tribute to the honored guests of Anacahuana's Taino. Other caciques from across the island are invited as well. Some say it is to submit everyone to Spanish authority, but Velazquez thinks she is instead organizing resistance right underneath their nose. Still, pretenses must be kept up, and Velazquez and his men indulge in the festivities and make friendly enough overtures to the natives. It seems to work for everyone. The Spanish are delighted with the feast, and the dancing, and the music. The festivities continue on into the night and then the next day, a process which repeats across 4 separate days. No one seems to know how and when this is supposed to end. And Anacahuana, seeing no other options, orders it to continue until the Spanish appear satiated. But somewhere along the 4th day, the mood shifts as subtly as the winds. The interpreters employed for this event are inadequate, making a hash of the efforts to communicate subtler expressions of fealty to the Spanish. Misunderstandings arise, defiance is assumed by the Spanish. Velazquez will brook none of it. Mutterings among the Spanish about a possible ambush are answered in half-understood translations by their interpreters. The festivities now run paranoid, and Velazquez, on orders from his governor, has had enough. He commands the caciques to congregate in the communal house. At a loss of what else to do, Anacahuana gives the order to her people to listen to what the Spanish say, gathering in the house in hopes of salvaging the situation. But once inside, Velazquez has Spanish soldiers block the door. From beyond the Spanish line, Velazquez can see Anacahuana staring out from among the crowd, searching him for an explanation to his behavior. Velazquez gives his answer to her in the form of a signal to his men. As he does so, Spaniards begin to throw torches onto the hatched roof of the communal house, setting it ablaze. The Taino inside panic. Those who attempt to flee out the door are butchered by the Spanish. As the house burns down, the structure collapses in parts, allowing for escape to a select few through a crumbled wall. Anacawana is among one of the few who manages to escape. She attempts to flee, but is captured by the Spanish, who haul her in front of Velazquez. Without her translator, she cannot understand Velazquez as he speaks of Spanish justice. She does not understand the legalism in which he speaks, a verbal sleight of hand employed by the Spanish to justify their cruelties. Velazquez, in indecipherable words, pronounces the crime of Anacawana, rebellion, and his sentence, death, by burning. Anacawana is dragged to the stake and set ablaze. As she is set on fire, Velazquez appears unmoved, even unbothered. It is just another day in the conquest of the Caribbean. It is now 1511. The surviving Taino have fled to Cuba, the island just west of Hispaniola and the largest of all in the Caribbean. It had been thought to have been the mainland at first by Colon, who insisted that the Ganges in India was only 10 days of sailing away from it. But by now it was becoming apparent to most, including the crown itself, that what Colon had discovered was not, in fact, Asia, but the admiral would continue to insist otherwise for the rest of his life. Velazquez asked for and received permission to lead an expedition to conquer Cuba. He was to lead a cadre of men, including such figures as Pamphilo de Narvaez and Pedro de Alvarado. Velazquez also brought with him a notary named Hernan Cortez, who would dutifully perform the actions expected of him as Velazquez founded Spanish towns in the conquered Cuban territory in an effort to legitimize his conquests. This young notary would take note of the way in which the legal fictions of this improvised empire could cover all manner of sins. Velazquez was to finance the expedition himself, and the crown was becoming stingier and stingier about financing any adventures in the Caribbean, as it seemed to lack any great reserves of gold up to this point. King Ferdinand, back in Spain, continued to remain obsessed with his Italian campaigns, which would hold his attention for the rest of his life and distract him from the developments in the Caribbean. The violence in the Caribbean reinforced itself, justified its own logic with every further conquest. With Hispaniola now vanquished, Velazquez landed his motley crew of would-be conquistadores on the shores of Cuba, and he christened it Baracoa. Immediate Cuban resistance was easily overcome. With their newest victories, the Spanish were also able to seize a man named Hatui, who was a cacique of Hispaniola that had managed to escape the island and continue his resistance from the next closest. It is said that when Hatui was captured and tied to the stake, he was asked if he would accept a baptism so that he could enter heaven after his death. Hatui considered the proposal for a moment and asked the friar if there were Spaniards in heaven. When he was told that yes, there were, Hatui responded that he would prefer not to be a Catholic and to go to hell instead. And so the Spanish obliged him and burned him to death. And so the campaign continued in much the same fashion. Pamphilo de Narvaez, serving as Velazquez's second in command, was particularly brutal in his treatment of the Cuban Taino and made a name for himself as a vicious warrior. In total, there were about 20 archers, 100 infantry, and a dozen or two horsemen who accompanied Velazquez on this campaign. Officially, their instructions were to convert and pacify, not kill, the natives, but these instructions were rarely carried out, and the massacres were justified along the lines that the people they encountered had resisted the Spanish offense. Given that the island had been claimed for Spain and all of its people subject to its crown, this campaign of conquest and murder was legally justifiable to the conquistadores as subduing the people in rebellion, and that all protections were off the table until they once again submitted. We see here a pattern beginning that would continue on throughout the construction of this illusory empire. A paper trail being constructed to legally justify illegal conquests. It was a conspiracy to legitimize what was inherently illegitimate, and its true tragedy wasn't that it happened, but that it worked. Narvaez, on more than one occasion, was said to have ridden into a local town and ordered the Dominican friar and protectorate of the Indians, Bartolome de las Casas, to tell the people they were now Spanish subjects and must give tribute to the crown. The use of translators does not seem to have been consistent, and the indigenous no doubt expressed curiosity and confusion about these fair-skinned, bearded people rambling in a language they could not understand before being attacked for reasons they could not comprehend. Among other problems, the Taino were not united politically as one unit, with some villages offering food to the Spanish regularly to supply their army, a common enough practice coming from the culture of hospitality common to the indigenous of the Americas. Over 1,000 Tainos would also join the conquistadores in their conquests, no doubt out of a mixture of curiosity and enthusiasm to leverage Spanish conquest in favor of settling scores against rival villages. The indigenous outnumbered the Spanish forces 9-1 and would set a precedent of Spanish warfare in the Americas being waged predominantly by indigenous collaborators, a fact often eluded in later histories and reports by the Spanish themselves. Velazquez was pleased at the progress that this campaign was making in taking over the island and founded its first capital, although there would be many more. He left back for Hispaniola, leaving his army under the charge of his nephew, Juan de Grijalva, while he attended matters back in Hispaniola. From there, Velazquez no doubt received regular reports about the conquest of Cuba. He would soon hear about how his lieutenant Narvaez had led his men to the village of Caubao, where hundreds of natives came out to meet the Spanish in amazement. After offering food to the conquistadores, the Spanish men indicated they wished to enter the large home in the center of the village, no doubt to look for signs of gold. Offended and suspicious of this presumption, hundreds of villagers gathered in the house to say no, offering additional food as an incentive to stay out. But for reasons unknown, one of Narvaez's men lost his patience and began killing indiscriminately, and soon a mood spread throughout the ranks. They butchered hundreds while Narvaez looked on, still and silent. Friar Las Casas, who would use this moment later on to become one of the most vicious critics of the Spanish Empire itself, stated that Narvaez smugly asked what he thought of the Spaniards' accomplishment in this village as it burned. Las Casas replied that he offered them and you to the devil, and later said of the affair, "I do not remember with how much spilling of blood that path was marked." The killing would go on for several more months, until such time the island was considered pacified to the point that Velazquez could return, and, at the appointment of Diego Colon, the admiral's son now in charge of the West Indies, could take up his post as governor in the year of 1513. He would hold that title for the rest of his life, and he would never return to Spain. Diego Velazquez is in love. One of the Suarez sisters, a gaggle of them among the first Spanish women in the colonies, has captured his attention. Enraptured, he spends his time in between the pacification of Cuba courting her. She is taken by the man and thinks nothing of the barbarism he displays towards the Taíno. Cortés, Velazquez's secretary, has long been known as a rake. He lives up to his reputation by courting another one of the Suarez sisters, Catalina, while Diego works over her sister. Cortés has loved her and left her, leaving behind a disreputable woman on a small island of big reputations among the colonists. Incensed, Velazquez aims to make an honest woman out of his sister-in-law-to-be. By pen or by sword, he will induce Cortés to marry Catalina, and so he dispatches a lieutenant to arrest him. Cortés, learning of the plot, flees for the sanctuary of a church. It only works for so long before he gets careless and walks outside and is arrested. In jail, he breaks his ankle to slip out of the chain and escape. Velazquez, in one of his usual quick-tempered rages, has Cortés hunted down and imprisoned again. But Cortés has learned from his first imprisonment, and has a card now to play of his own. Documents he has written in his capacity as notary are unfavorable to Velazquez, and held securely by a confidant outside the prison. Cortés bargains with Velazquez. "Release me, and I won't release the documents and damn your reputation." Velazquez, a proud old man, relents to his protege, but only on the condition that Cortés marry Catalina. It is agreed. Both men will harbor a grudge over the incident that will be the seed of future conflicts to bloom. Diego Velazquez soon proved to be a useful governor for the Spanish and received direct permission from the king to govern Cuba as he pleased, independent of Diego Colon. And so Velazquez began the encomienda system in earnest, allowing settlers to retain the services of up to 300 indigenous, provided by a local cacique, using the servants as they saw fit, while also granting tracts of land to the colonists for farming. One innovation of Velazquez's was that he encouraged the settlers to begin farming local crops such as cassava and maize, rather than just the foreign imports, like wheat. The Spanish colonial economy was taking its first steps into diversifying its output. In economic development, it would progress with fits and starts throughout the next several centuries. Spanish women and wives also began to be sent for, as the colonies became permanent and developed, though this did not always stop the men of Spain from seizing and abusing local women. Velazquez himself married a woman in the colony's first Christian marriage, though his unfortunate bride, one of the aforementioned Suarez sisters, died only a week after the wedding from tropical fevers, another casualty of the intense climate that the Spanish so often found themselves constitutionally unsuitable to live in. But for whatever personal tragedies he suffered, Velazquez lived like a prince, and had succeeded in bringing the old feudal system of patronage and privileges from Europe and transplanting it badly onto these new lands of the West Indies. Indigenous were forced to provide food and labor for the Spaniards under penalty of mutilation or death, and their villages were often destroyed as the Taino were forcibly relocated into new Spanish-created towns in order to centralize their population. Just as it had been in Hispaniola, the population of the natives began to decline quickly, and the Spaniards, having learned nothing, observed in frustration as their supply of labor began to dwindle yet again. Just as before, settlers put pressure on the colonial administration to seek new sources of labor and wealth in the colonies, and backed their pressure with constant revolts against official Spanish authority. Velazquez filled his time with nightly gatherings of friends and high-ranking colonizers. He spent the evenings drinking and rambling about this or that story or idea, and grew fat on the profits of his encomienda system that many starry-eyed settlers chase after, and only a few succeeded under. Sometimes, at these nightly gatherings, even Cortez would make an appearance, to spar and suck up to his old boss, who seems to have forgiven Cortecito, as he was sometimes called, once again. For all their talk of Caribbean cannibals used to justify their own cruelties, the Spanish were cannibalizing the empire all on their own. As they spread out across the islands, they consumed everything in their path, ruining the indigenous population along the way. It was a holocaust, one that the Spanish were slow to realize, and the success of its perpetrators undermined their own goals of having a serf-like labor force to enrich them with gold which never materialized. But with Cuba now pacified, at least on paper, Diego Velazquez's mind was already elsewhere. The Caribbean had given him slaves, sugar, and prestige, but that gold remained illusory. And worse, Diego Colón, son of the admiral, still dominated the Caribbean, staking claims from atop the Spanish hierarchy. Velazquez knew the crown's favor was fickle, and if he didn't act quickly, Colón could snatch the next great discovery right out from underneath the governor's nose. And so Velazquez, acting on rumors of riches to be found in the Yucatan, authorized a reconnaissance mission, an expedition that had to be fast, decisive, and above all, his own. He had to find a lieutenant who could carry out his orders and be trusted absolutely. And so he tapped Francisco Hernández de Córdoba to lead it, a man loyal to Velazquez and utterly devoid of the imagination it would take to subvert his boss's orders. Hernández and his partners outfitted 2 ships, while Velazquez himself paid for a third. At stake was a license to conquer known as the Adelantado, which required proof of a new land to conquer before it would be granted. But, once granted, would give whoever held it the sole right to plunder the new land as they saw fit. Officially, Córdoba was tasked with scouting new coasts and gathering slaves to shore up the failing encomiendas. But the true mission was intelligence. Chart the mysterious land the admiral had once glimpsed on a previous voyage, return with gold and wonders, and place them directly into Velazquez's hands. A clock was ticking. Delay meant gossip in Seville, rumors in court, and Colón's agents filing papers that might erase Velazquez's claim before it was even inked. As the 3 ships of this first expedition left Cuba in February 1517, Velazquez brooded. If they succeeded, the door to a new empire could open for him. But if they failed, he'd be left with nothing but excuses, and Colón would tighten the noose. But the paranoia was the point. Velazquez needed speed. He needed proof. He needed Córdoba's ships to return before the dream of empire slipped into someone else's hands. And so Velazquez waited in Cuba like a gambler who'd staked everything on a single throw. Weeks dragged on. He heard nothing. Rumors multiplied. Córdoba's ships had been lost to the storms. The crews had mutinied, or worse. They'd made contact with something truly valuable and were hiding it from him. He couldn't shake the thought that every day of silence was another day Diego Colón had to whisper in royal ears and plot in the court of Spain, turning Velazquez into an afterthought of the empire his labor had built. But later, when survivors of the de Córdoba expedition finally limped back into port, their story was chaos. Blood, gold, strange cities, temples, defeats. Velazquez barely heard the details. He heard opportunity and the ticking clock behind it. Cordoba himself returned half dead, riddled with arrows he had sustained in an indigenous attack. His men were terrified, but they had brought back proof of something larger than the islands. Gold, civilization, a mainland. Exactly the kind of evidence the crown demanded before granting authority. But Velazquez's satisfaction was soon poisoned by dread. If Cordoba's battered expedition could stumble onto riches, then anyone could. Another captain might already be plotting to sail there next. Colon might be preparing petitions even as Velazquez listened. He knew Spain's court. Favor flowed toward whoever arrived first, not necessarily who deserved it. Velazquez resolved that he had no choice. He would mount another expedition immediately, bigger and better, stamped with his name before any rival could act. Cordoba's bruised, bloody men hadn't given him certainty, but they had given him urgency. He saw shadows everywhere. Conspirators in Spain, rivals in Cuba, even his own captains whispering about breaking away from him. Cordoba had gone to explore, but Velazquez understood the truth. Exploration was only a race against time, a pretext to conquest. Against Colon, against betrayal, against history itself. One which remembered only the man who planted the flag first. Velazquez doubled down. After Cordoba died from his wounds, Velazquez commandeered the man's legacy, saying that his voyage had been financed by Velazquez alone, and thus solely belonged to the governor. In an effort to launch a new expedition, he circumvented the need to involve Diego Colon at all by appealing directly to the governor of Hispaniola for the right to launch a second voyage. There would be 4 ships this time. His own coin poured into the venture, and he put his nephew Juan de Grijalba in charge. The thinking was that blood was safer than loyalty bought. On paper, Velazquez's instructions to Grijalba were once again cautious. Explore, trade, do not settle. But he knew better, and so did Grijalba. If the chance appeared, they should act. Everyone was supposed to have understood the real mission. Outmaneuver Colon before he could sniff opportunity. Plant the flag, claim the Yucatan. With Grijalva was Pedro de Alvarado, one of the most brutal commanders of the conquest to conquer Cuba, and a man Velazquez believed he could trust. With all the pieces in place, the second voyage set off. Weeks passed, and once again Velazquez found himself inconsolable with impatience. The governor, who was often jovial enough with his fellow colonists, turned morose, reclusive, and withdrew from the tiny society he had once lorded over. He became obsessed with betrayal everywhere, nowhere more so than in the recent, prying, overeager friendliness of Cortez, who understood something of the mood swings of his old boss and suspected something big was afoot. But soon enough, there was news. Pedro de Alvarado returned early with trinkets of gold, cotton, tobacco, and stories of cities bigger than anything found in the Indies. Velazquez all but trembled. Proof. He pictured the faces in Spain when they saw it. But then came the rage. Alvarado said that Grijalva was on his way back, and that in a dispute between the captain and his subordinates on whether or not to settle, Grijalva had won out and commanded they all return to Cuba. Why had Grijalva obeyed his orders literally? Why hadn't he broken the rules, planted a colony, claimed the land outright? Velazquez believed he could smell it. Colon's lawyers, waiting like vultures to argue that Velazquez had hesitated, that he had been timid, that others were better suited. By the time Grijalva limped back months later, Velazquez's mind had already turned. His nephew's loyalty was worth little if it brought him nothing to leverage in Spain. He greeted Grijalva coldly, the gold in his hand but the adelantado title still out of reach. And worse, every delay made it more likely his rivals would catch up, twist the story, and erase his name. Velazquez realized he had only one card left to play. If his nephew lacked the nerve, he'd find another captain willing to gamble everything. Someone reckless enough to stake it all and bind himself so tightly to Velazquez that betrayal should be all but unthinkable. That man, as history would have it, was Hernan Cortez. Having exhausted much of his wealth in funding the previous 2 expeditions, Velazquez needed someone who was willing to take on the burden of financing most or all of the next one. He had gone through a short list of candidates who all proved to this or to that for the expedition. Most did not want to leave Cuba, where they had worked hard to establish themselves for years, and especially so on chasing after Velazquez's mysterious new land for Velazquez's benefit alone. It was only by exhausting this short list that Velazquez settled on his old notary and secretary, Cortés. And so Cortés was chosen by Velazquez precisely because he was considered a mediocre option. A man of some fortune and seemingly little ambition, who had failed to have made much of an impact in the colonies so far, but who nevertheless had some appetite for gambling. Rich as Cortés was from his mines and plantations, Velazquez saw no threat in this man and figured that Cortés was popular enough a colonist to attract the support of others. The instructions given to Cortés were simple. Continue to explore and trade modestly in the lands that Grijalva had reportedly found, but failed to settle. Playing cards, gambling, blasphemy, and sleeping with native women were all expressly forbidden in the contract drawn up, as was the transportation and use of Taino slaves. Cortés was also made to spread the word of the Christian God and investigate what, if any, religion the native peoples of this land had. He was also to rectify the damage done by Córdoba's battles with the natives last year, and to gather information about vegetation in these lands, to never sleep on shore, and to, of course, find the source of the gold Alvarado had brought back from Grijalva's expedition. In return for this litany of clauses agreed to, Cortés managed to extract an admission from Velazquez that, in the event of unexpected emergencies, he was empowered to take such measures as would conform most closely to the service of God and their highnesses. It was a dangerously open-ended clause. They were also to investigate various rumors held by the Spanish of these foreign lands, to find a mythical land of Amazonians, to find a supposed race of people with enormous ears, and to find yet another magical race of people who supposedly had the faces of dogs. Clearly, Velazquez was putting all of his eggs into one Cortesista basket, and hoping that the basket would be returned to him filled with riches beyond his imagination. But the famously indecisive Velazquez soon began to fret about this latest decision. He watched as Cortés spent lavishly on new clothes of velvet and gold, spent more on weaponry, rations, and ships to fund his new adventure. He also watched as Pedro de Alvarado, hungry to return to the land he had seen on Grijalva's cautious voyage, was recruited by Cortés directly. A voyage of this size, which usually took months to plan, was organized by Cortés in 2 weeks and outfitted with several ships and 300 men. It seemed to Velazquez that Cortés had taken the charge of his contract far beyond what was written in letter. He was not preparing to trade and to explore, but to settle. And Velazquez was beginning to doubt in whose name Cortés was planning this settlement. Bartolomé de las Casas wrote that upon Cortés's appointment to the head of this third expedition, quote, "Finally, he there showed himself as a great lord, and as if he had been born in brocade and with such authority that no one dared to show him anything but love." Unquote. Cortés financed this appearance of lordliness primarily on debt, some of which he owed to Velazquez himself. Velazquez had also sponsored some of the ships for the expedition, though cautioned Cortés he was to buy more on his own dime. This split in the financing would cause some great disagreement between the two, a disagreement which would follow each of them, in some way, to their graves. It was becoming clear to Velazquez that his conception of the mission and Cortés's were not one of the same, and he soon came to regret it, as he would imply in conversation at his nightly dinners of distinguished guests and extended family. He wavered, going back and forth on whether to allow Cortés to leave or not. Cortés, for his part, also heard these rumors of his patron's skepticism and moved quickly to get his voyage going before anyone could stop him. Velazquez couldn't face his ex-protégé face-to-face to deliver the news, once he had decided, and sent various messengers to Cortés to explain that he was being relieved of command. Cortés and his supporters skirted this by pretending not to hear from one messenger and arranging for the murder of another. Cortés was taking his voyage to sea, Velazquez be damned. Velazquez finally decided, too little too late, that he would take it upon himself to deliver the news. He went down to the docks where Cortés was already loaded onto a small boat to take him aboard one of the brigantines, flanked by armed guards. As he paddled away, Velazquez shouted after Cortés from the dock, "How is this, my friend, that you are setting off in this way? Is this a good way to say goodbye to me?" Cortés replied, "Forgive me, but these things have all been thought about some time before they were ordered. What now are your orders?" Velazquez stood there humiliated by this insubordination of his once closest devotee. He made no reply. Cortés had won the Battle of Wills and set off to sea on 18 November 1518. The Spanish Empire in its early Caribbean days had not come about by plan, but by circumstance. It was at first a comedy and then a tragedy of errors. The Spanish had never meant to land on these shores, but once they had, and had failed to comprehend the significance of their discovery, they wasted no time in stripping down the islands to their barest resources, stranding themselves in a newly depleted world which threatened to strangle them in their own incompetence. It was only the rumor of a land beyond the islands that sustained their efforts to continue on in a futile quest for riches. Velazquez's pursuit of the fabled Yucatan, somewhere beyond the sea, became the urtext for understanding the psychology of these Spaniards who so often ate their own. Grijalva's return should have secured Velazquez's glory, but it instead exposed the fatal flaw in Spain's empire in the Caribbean. Everything was improvisation. Expeditions were launched on half-truths and lies. Captains obeyed orders only until they didn't, and every scrap of gold or rumor of great cities was cannibalized into someone else's claim. Velazquez had gambled heavily on his nephew, and Grijalva had failed him. Not for lack of courage, but for following instructions too faithfully. No colony, no foothold, no adelantado. Just trinkets, stories, and the sense that Spain's rivals, and worse, his own, were already circling. And so Velazquez turned to a new captain, Hernán Cortés, a man charming enough to win loyalty, reckless enough to overstep, and ambitious enough to stab his patron in the back the moment it suited him. Velazquez, blinded by paranoia and desperate for proof, handed Cortés the keys to his fortune and his own ruin. Velazquez was not unique, but was instead emblematic of the empire he was intertwined with. The Spanish Empire was being built bit by betrayal piled on betrayal, each man consuming the gains of the last, and nothing embodied that treachery more completely than the relationship between Velazquez and Cortés. Next week, we will return to Old Mexico and the Mexica world the Spaniards were about to enter, one that was no less fractured. Because on the shores beyond, another storm was brewing, the succession crisis in Texcoco. Tlatoani Nezuapili's death had torn his kingdom in two, and his sons, Cacama and Ixtlilxochitl, turned Texcoco into a battlefield of bloodlines. It was a civil war hidden in plain sight, where kinship meant nothing and every alliance was temporary. And in that chaos, Ixtlilxochitl would rise, not just as rival claimant, but as the embodiment of the cracks spreading through the triple alliance of the Aztec Empire itself. The Spanish thought they were stepping into new lands. In truth, they were stumbling into an old feud, one that would decide not just the fate of Texcoco, but the fate of an empire. And so that's all for this episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On. Written, narrated, and produced by Gavrilo Z, with music composed and performed by Jake Krasiniak. If you like the show, tell your friends. All my listeners are appreciated. Thank you, and see you next time.